Celine Voss had not eaten since 4 in the morning, and her hands, still marked faintly at the left wrist by the pale ridge of an old watchband, were folded in her lap with a stillness that looked like patience, and was not. The kitchen of the Hartwell house smelled of roasting meat and a particular species of judgment that requires no words to travel from one end of a room to the other. It was 23 minutes past 1 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late November, and the family had been seated for 11 minutes. And in those 11 minutes, Margaret Hartwell had said the word useless twice without saying it directly to Celine, which was, in its way, a more refined version of the thing. The first time Margaret said it about the centerpiece, a low arrangement of dried wheat and orange candles that Celine had set out at 7 that morning, before anyone else had come downstairs. The second time she said it about the practice of women who acquire skills nobody needs anymore, and she said this while looking at the empty chair to Celine's right, as though the empty chair had an opinion she was waiting for. The room held 12 people. 7 of them looked at their water glasses. 2 of them reached for bread rolls that had not yet been passed. One, a man in his early 60s with a jaw like poured concrete and a dark jacket that carried no insignia and required none, set down his wine glass with great care, the base of the stem touching the tablecloth without a sound, and looked at Celine with an expression that was not pity and was not surprise, and was instead something far more careful than either of those. Celine did not look back at him. She moved her thumb 1 centimeter along the inner surface of her left wrist, where the pale ridge was, and found the small raised edge of the thing she wore there on a thin cord tucked under her sleeve, and she held it, and she breathed, and she did not speak. The man in the dark jacket, whose name was Admiral Desmond Farrow, retired from active service 14 months prior after 31 years in the United States Navy, sat very still and watched a woman he had not seen in 8 years sit at a table where no one knew what she was, and he understood something about the next few hours that nobody else in the room was equipped to understand. Something was going to come apart. It was not going to be Celine Voss. Before we go any further, if you have ever sat in a room full of people who had no idea what you had already done, drop the word "still standing" in the comments and hit subscribe, because this story is exactly about that. It was still morning, technically, when Celine had pulled her car into the Hartwell driveway, 3 hours before any other guest arrived. The house sat at the end of a long gravel lane in Faircastle County, 37 miles from the nearest naval installation, which was a distance Celine had once been able to cover in just under 40 minutes under non-ideal conditions, and which now felt, on a quiet November morning with dry leaves lining both sides of the road, like a measurement from someone else's life. She had driven it in just over an hour because she had stopped once, at a gas station outside Morro Falls, to use the restroom and to stand for 2 minutes beside her car with her face turned into the wind, the way she had trained herself to do in the years when she could not afford to let anything show before she walked into a room. She was 39 years old. She wore dark trousers and a cream-colored blouse that was neither expensive nor cheap, and over it a coat that had been good once and was now simply warm, and she had not replaced it because replacing it had not risen to the level of a problem worth solving. She carried a covered dish of sweet potato and a bottle of wine she had chosen carefully for $18, and she brought both of these things to the side door of the Hartwell house, and knocked rather than using the key her husband Callum had given her 15 months ago when they married, because this was not her house, and she had never pretended otherwise. Callum's mother, Margaret Hartwell, opened the door. Margaret was 64, and she wore a blouse of a particular shade of cream that cost considerably more than Celine's, and she had the specific and well-maintained composure of a woman who has measured every room she has ever entered, and found herself, generally, at the correct end of it. She looked at the covered dish and said that was very thoughtful, in a tone that made thoughtfulness sound like an achievement accessible to most animals. She looked at the wine and said, Callum usually brings something from the Dorset selection, which was not information Celine needed and was not offered as information. It was offered as a coordinate. Celine said she was sure it would be fine, and stepped inside and began, without being asked, to find the correct shelf in the refrigerator for the dish, and to locate the corkscrew, and to identify which burner on the range ran hot, because these were the kinds of assessments she made on entry to any space, automatically and without performance, in the way a person makes them when the habit of them has been pressed into the body by years of needing to know exactly what a room contained and what it could do. She had been doing this, in some version, since she was 22 years old. That was 17 years of it. The kitchen did not know that. Margaret did not know that. The house did not know that, and the house was not going to be told. The other guests arrived between noon and 12:45. Callum arrived at 12:30, having come from his firm's holiday lunch, and he kissed Celine on the cheek and asked if everything was all right in a way that meant was she all right, rather than was everything all right, which was a distinction she appreciated and did not remark on. His brother Theo arrived with his partner Dana, who was warm in a way that cost her nothing and gave it freely, and who had said to Celine at last year's Thanksgiving, quietly and without ceremony, that she thought Celine was the most self-possessed person she had ever met, which Celine had accepted with a single nod, because she did not know what to do with compliments that were accurate. Margaret's sister arrived with her husband and their 2 adult children, and one colleague of Margaret's late husband, a man named Gerald Hatch, who wore cufflinks with the seal of a maritime insurance company on them, and who spoke about real estate for 11 minutes without being asked. And then, at 12:47, there was a knock at the front door, which was unusual, because most guests had been using the side entrance, and Margaret went to answer it, and there was a pause of approximately 15 seconds before she brought Admiral Desmond Farrow into the dining room. She introduced him as Desmond, a friend of a friend who was in the county for the week and had nowhere to be for the holiday, which was socially gracious of her and was also approximately a quarter of the truth. Farrow was 62. He wore the dark jacket and a plain white shirt, and he shook hands with each person at a steady pace that neither rushed nor lingered, and when he reached Celine, he took her hand and said it had been a long time, and Celine said yes. It had been 8 years, and she said it with the same flatness she used for all of her sentences. And Callum looked between them for one moment, and then Farrow moved on to Gerald Hatch, and Gerald Hatch asked him about maritime insurance, which was the kind of question you could only ask someone like Farrow if you had no way of reading him, and Farrow answered it briefly and without malice. They sat down. Margaret served. Celine passed the sweet potato dish when it came near her, and she noted that Margaret did not serve herself from it, and she noted that 3 other people did, and she noted none of this with any expression. The dried wheat centerpiece cast small shadows on the tablecloth. The candles had not been lit. Celine had not asked about the candles. 23 minutes after they sat down, Margaret Hartwell said the word useless for the second time, and the room looked at its water glasses, and Farrow set his wine down, and Celine found the thin cord at her wrist. If you have ever carried a weight nobody at the table could see, drop still standing in the comments right now. Because what Celine wore on that cord was not a piece of jewelry, and it was not a memento, and understanding what it was requires going back 11 years to a naval air station on the eastern seaboard on a night that had no business going the way it did. The cord was thin and waxed and brown, and the thing at the end of it was a small flat disc of brass, the size of a quarter, and on one face of it was engraved a set of numbers that corresponded to nothing a civilian would recognize, and to something very specific that any naval aviator from the right period would know on sight, and on the other face of it were 2 words. The words were, "Find her." Celine had been a naval flight surgeon for 11 years, attached to the carrier group that operated out of Northeastern Fleet Command, and she had flown, In that capacity, a number of operational sorties that she was not permitted to discuss, and several hundred training and emergency medical missions that she was. And she had been decorated twice and had never once brought the decorations to a dinner table or a family gathering or a room where they might have changed the temperature of the air in her favor, because it had never occurred to her that that was what decorations were for. The last year of her service had been the year she had lost Lieutenant Priya Adeyemi, and this was the loss she had carried since. And this was what Callum knew about only in outline, and what nobody else at the Hartwell table knew at all. Priya Adeyemi had been 26 years old and had been Celine's flight medic on a night medical evacuation in conditions that were, to use the formal language of the investigation that followed, not within approved operational parameters, and Celine had made the call to go anyway, and they had made the extraction, and on the return, Priya had been struck by equipment that shifted in turbulence and had not come home. The investigation had found no fault with Celine's decision. Celine had not found the same. She had carried the brass disc since the week after the funeral, when Priya's mother had pressed it into her hand and told her that Priya had kept it on her own person throughout her service, and that Priya had told her once it was from a doctor who had taught her how to stay alive in conditions that were not interested in her survival, and that the words on it were the only instruction Priya had ever written down. Find her. Celine had understood at the time that this was forgiveness wearing the shape of a charge, and she had worn the disc every day for 8 years, and had not told anyone what it said until the evening in the Hartwell house, when she would finally tell Pharaoh, which was not a conversation she had planned for a Thursday in November, and which was going to happen because of what Pharaoh had set in motion before anyone at that table knew it. They found a moment alone in the hallway off the kitchen at 2:20, after the meal had ended and the dishes had been moved and the room had rearranged itself into the slow post-meal drift of a family gathering where some people are comfortable and some people are managing. Pharaoh had said, in the manner of a man who requires no permission to be direct, that he wanted to speak with her. Celine had said all right. They stood 4 feet apart in the hallway, and the light there was the particular yellow of an older fixture that nobody had replaced. And Pharaoh said that he had known who she was the moment he saw her, and that he had not come to the county to see a friend of a friend, but had been asked to come here, specifically by the secretary of a naval committee that was in the process of reviewing and formally recognizing a set of operational decisions made during a night medical evacuation 11 years ago, and that her name had appeared in the review documents, and that they had been looking for her for 8 months, because she had moved 3 times and changed her civilian practice twice, and had not, in 8 years, presented herself as anyone a committee might need to find. Celine did not speak for a moment. She looked at the yellowed light fixture. She said, Priya's family knew where I was. Pharaoh said yes. He said Priya's mother had told the committee the same thing he was telling Celine now, which was that the decision that night had been made by a doctor who understood the difference between a risk that was acceptable and a risk that was merely certain, and who had chosen the acceptable one, and who had been right. Celine said she had not been right. She said that plainly and without heat. Pharaoh said the committee agreed with her on the specific outcome, and disagreed with her on the specific decision, which were, he said, 2 different things, and he had always heard she knew the difference. Celine found the disc through the fabric of her sleeve. She said she had worn it every day for 8 years. Pharaoh looked at the wrist. He did not ask to see it. He said, she would have wanted you to be in a room where people knew what you were. Celine said nothing for a moment. Then she said that was not why you did the work. Pharaoh said he knew that. He said that was exactly why they needed her name on the record. The hallway was quiet. From the dining room came the sound of Theo saying something and Dana laughing, and the ordinary sounds of a family moving through the hours after a meal. Celine breathed once, deliberately. She said she would speak with the committee. She did not say anything else, and Pharaoh asked nothing more. And the first loop that had been running since she found the cord that morning was, in that moment, closed. It was at 3:41 that afternoon, 14 minutes after Celine and Farrow had returned to the dining room, that the front of the Hartwell house became the site of a situation that required exactly the competence nobody in the room had thought to locate there. Gerald Hatch's wife, Norma, who was 67 and had been quiet through most of the meal and had drunk 3 glasses of a Dorset Red without incident, stood up from the parlor chair she had been sitting in and took one step toward the window and said she did not feel well, and then she sat down heavily on the floor, in a way that was not a fall and was not controlled, and 3 people in the room moved toward her, and none of them knew what to do when they got there. Celine was across the room in 4 steps. She had Norma's wrist in her hand before anyone had said anything useful, and she was counting against the second hand of the watch she wore on her right wrist, and she said in a clear and even voice, "Nobody touch her. Give me the floor. Move the chair back 2 feet. Callum moved the chair. Dana backed up. Theo said, should he call 911? And Celine said, yes, call now. Tell them conscious unresponsive with irregular pulse. Give them the address and stay on with them. She was already opening Norma's collar with 2 fingers and speaking to Norma in the specific and steady register of a person who has spoken to semi-conscious patients in loud and unstable environments and has learned to produce, in their voice, the exact quality of assurance that is not false. She said, "Norma, I'm a doctor. I have you. Stay with me." Norma's eyes tracked to Celine's face and held there. Celine said pulse was slow and irregular, said to Gerald, who was standing 3 feet away with his cufflinks catching the light, that she needed him to tell her if Norma had any cardiac history, any medications, anything from the last 24 hours. Gerald said she had a pacemaker, fitted 3 years ago, and had taken her medications that morning. Celine said good, thank you, and continued to hold the wrist and count and speak, and she checked Norma's airway and she assessed the color of her nail beds and the particular character of her breathing. And she did all of this with the unhurried precision of a person who has done it, or something very close to it, in the back of an aircraft moving through turbulence at altitude in the dark, and who does not need a hospital room and a full kit to do the essential work of keeping a person present. The ambulance arrived in 11 minutes. The paramedics were inside within 30 seconds of the door opening, and Celine stepped back and gave them a handover in the clean, sequential language of clinical transfer. Age, history, onset time, pulse character, airway status, interventions, and she gave it to them in under 45 seconds, which was exactly as long as it needed to take. And when she finished, the lead paramedic looked at her and said, "You're a physician." And Celine said yes, and the paramedic said good handover, and that was the entirety of what passed between them. Norma was moved to the stretcher. Gerald went with her. The room stood very still. Margaret Hartwell was standing near the window. She had been standing there since approximately the moment Celine had said, "Give me the floor," and she had not moved, and she did not look away from Celine, and she did not speak, and neither did anyone else in the room. The paramedics confirmed at the hospital that evening that Norma Hatch had experienced a sustained arrhythmia related to a pacemaker calibration that had drifted outside its optimal parameters over the preceding 6 weeks, and that the clinical management on scene had been, the attending physician wrote in his follow-up letter to Gerald Hatch, consistent with advanced emergency care, and had prevented a secondary event during the wait for emergency services. This was the letter's language and not Celine's, and Celine did not read it until 3 weeks later, when Gerald Hatch mailed her a copy with a handwritten note that said only, "I did not know," which was not an apology, and was not an apology, and was at least the truth. Margaret Hartwell came to Celine before the ambulance had cleared the driveway. She stood 18 inches away, which was closer than she had stood at any point in the 15 months of Celine's marriage to her son, and she said that she had not known Celine was a physician. Celine said she was. She said she had left active naval service 8 years ago and had been in civilian practice since. Margaret said, in a voice that had lost something it had carried all day, that she wished she had known that. Celine looked at her and said, without unkindness and without warmth, that it was information she had been willing to share, and then she moved to find Callum, because the conversation was complete. Pharaoh was near the front door, coat in hand, preparing to leave. He stopped when she passed him and said he would be in touch within the week. She said she knew he would. He looked at the left wrist where the cord disappeared under the cuff, and he said she was a good flight medic. Celine said she was the best she had worked with. Pharaoh said that would go on the record too. Celine said thank you and meant it, and he nodded once and left. Callum was in the kitchen. He had his jacket still on, and he had been washing glasses for no clear reason. And when Celine came in, he turned and they stood in the kitchen of his mother's house with the smell of the meal still in the air and the afternoon light going flat through the window. And he said, "Are you all right?" She said yes. He said he had watched her from across the room and had not recognized her. She said she knew. He said he meant that as a specific thing, not a criticism, and she said she understood that. He put down the glass. He said, "Tell me about Priya." She did. She stood in the kitchen with the cord at her wrist and told him about a 26-year-old flight medic and a night that was not within approved operational parameters, and a decision she had made and had been carrying since. And she told it to him plainly, in the way she told most things, which was without the vocabulary of drama, and he listened in the way she had decided to marry him for, which was without interruption, and without flinching, and without filling the silence when she stopped. She did not cry. She did not say everything. She said enough. The formal review was completed in early March, 4 months later. The Naval Committee issued a written finding that the operational decision made by Lieutenant Commander Celine Voss on the night in question was consistent with accepted risk parameters given the available information at time of decision, and that the outcome, while tragic, did not reflect a failure of command judgment. The finding was entered into the permanent service record, which had been closed since her separation and was now amended, and a copy was sent to Priya Adeyemi's mother, who had requested it. Celine was not at a ceremony because there was no ceremony and she had not asked for one. She was notified by letter, which was how she had been notified of most things in her service life, and which felt, on this occasion, exactly right. She returned to her civilian practice on the same Tuesday she received the letter, which was a regular clinic day, and she saw 9 patients between 8 and 4, and she did not tell any of them about the letter. In July of that year, a new maritime emergency simulation center opened at a naval training installation in the region, and in the building's procedural library, which was the room reserved for case studies used in the training of flight medics, a small plaque was mounted beside the door. Celine had submitted the request without ceremony and without explanation, and the plaque read, "This library is named for Flight Medic First Class Priya Adeyemi, 1987 to 2013, who knew that finding the patient is the first intervention." She had drafted the wording herself in less than 10 minutes, alone in her study on a Tuesday evening in February, and had not shown it to anyone until she submitted it. Callum read it at the opening and did not speak for a moment, and then he put his hand over hers, and she let him. The junior colleague, a newly commissioned flight medic named Torres, who had been assigned to the installation 6 weeks earlier, and who had heard, in the way that things are heard in training environments, a version of the story that had grown in the telling, came to Celine at the reception after the opening and said, carefully, that he had heard she had once made a call in impossible conditions that nobody else would have made, and that it had changed how the service thought about night medical extraction. Celine looked at him. She was 39 years old, and she had heard the story put back to her in larger shapes than the one it actually had, and she did not correct the size of it so much as she returned it to its actual dimensions. She said she had made a call and it had cost them a medic, and the committee had found the call was sound, and she had not made peace with that, and she was not sure she was supposed to. She said Priya Adeyemi had been the best flight medic she had worked with, and the library was named for her, and that was the only part of the story that needed to be remembered. Torres nodded. He looked at the plaque. He said he understood. Celine turned back to the room, and the disc was at her wrist under the cuff of her jacket, and it was small and warm, and exactly where it had been every day for 8 years, and she did not reach for it, because for the first time in 8 years she did not need to. If this story reminded you of someone who carried more than the room ever knew, drop "still standing" in the comments. There are more stories on this channel about people who did the work without asking anyone to notice, and we will keep telling them. Every one of them deserves to be on the record. The week after the library opening, Celine received a second letter. This one came not from the Naval Committee but from a woman named Cecile Adeyemi, who was 71 years old and lived in a small house in coastal South Carolina that Celine had visited once, 8 years ago, on a November afternoon not entirely unlike this one, and had not visited since because she had not known how to return to a place where she had been given something she was not sure she had earned. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on plain white paper in a script that was even and unhurried, and it said a number of things that Celine read sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, before Callum was awake, with a cup of coffee that went cold while she read. Cecile Adeyemi said that she had followed the review process from the beginning, that Admiral Farrow had kept her informed at each stage, and that she had asked for the formal finding to be entered into Priya's service record, not because she had ever doubted Celine's decision, but because she knew Celine needed the institution to say it in language Celine would accept. She said she had known this because Priya had told her, in the months before the accident, that Celine was the kind of doctor who would carry a bad outcome forever if nobody official gave her the words that said the outcome was not the same as the decision. Cecile said that Priya had said this with admiration, not with concern. She said she was glad about the library. She said she was glad the plaque said what it said about finding the patient, because that was the thing Priya had repeated most often in her letters home, the idea that getting to the patient was not the conclusion of the work but the beginning of it, and that Celine had taught her that. Then she said one more thing. She said that the brass disc had been made for Celine in the first place. She said Priya had the disc engraved during her 3rd month of flight medic training and had carried it as a reminder, not of Celine specifically, but of the instruction, and that when Cecile pressed it into Celine's hand at the funeral, she had done so because she believed the reminder belonged with the person who had first made it necessary, and who had, Cecile thought, probably forgotten it applied to her. The letter was signed simply, Cecile. Celine read it through twice. She put it down on the table and looked at the window, where the morning light was the particular flat gray of late winter coming undone at its edges toward something warmer, and she sat with it for a long time. Then she folded the letter along its original creases and put it in the inside breast pocket of her coat, which was hanging on the hook by the door, the coat that had been good once and was now simply warm, and she left it there, where she would find it every time she put the coat on, which was nearly every day, because the cold was not finished yet. She wrote back to Cecile Adeyemi that same evening. She wrote a single page. She said that she had worn the disc every day for 8 years and had not, until she read the letter, understood entirely what she was carrying, or for whom. She said she thought she had been carrying it as a debt. She said she understood now it had been given as a direction, and that the distinction was significant, and that she was grateful. She said she intended to visit if Cecile would have her in the spring. She mailed the letter the following morning on her way to clinic. She did not read it back before she sealed it, which was not how she usually did things, and which felt, for reasons she did not examine, correct. Callum read Cecile's letter 3 days after Celine received it, not because Celine showed it to him immediately, but because she left it on the kitchen table one evening, and he saw it there and looked at her, and she nodded, and he sat down and read it while she finished making dinner. He did not speak while he read. When he finished, he put it down and said, "She made the disc for you." Celine said yes. He said, "And you thought you were paying a debt." She said she supposed she had. He sat with that for a moment. He said, 8 years is a long time to repay something that wasn't owed. Celine said that was what made it the right length of time. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the kitchen on Thanksgiving afternoon when she had told him about Priya, which was the particular and quiet way of a person who understands that there are people in the world who will not be argued out of their standards and who can be loved anyway, and perhaps most clearly because of it. He did not argue with her. He put the letter back in order and folded it and handed it to her, and she put it in the coat pocket where it lived. Dinner was quiet in the good way, the way of two people who do not need to fill the air between them, and afterward Celine washed the dishes and Callum dried them, and they stood in the kitchen with the radio on low, something instrumental that neither of them was listening to, and it was an ordinary evening in a way that Celine had not been confident, for several years, that she was allowed to have. Spring came the way it comes in that part of the country, gradually and then all at once, with 1 week in March that was still cold enough to require the coat, and 1 week in April that was not. Celine drove to South Carolina on a Saturday in the 3rd week of April. She drove alone, which was a decision she and Callum had discussed briefly and resolved without difficulty, because he understood, and because some visits are not about the people you bring with you. She brought nothing except a small arrangement of flowers she had stopped to buy at a roadside stand 20 minutes outside Cecile Adeyemi's town, yellow and white and loosely bundled, the kind of arrangement that does not announce itself as significant. Cecile's house was a pale blue bungalow set 40 feet back from a street lined with live oaks, and it had a front porch with 2 chairs and a small table between them. And when Celine came up the front walk, Cecile was already on the porch, as though she had heard the car from inside, or had been expecting her at this hour, or both. Cecile Adeyemi was 71, and she was small and upright, and she wore a cardigan the color of dark plum, and her hands, when she took Celine's hands in both of hers, were warm and dry, and held on for a moment longer than a greeting required. She said it was good that Celine had come. Celine said she was sorry it had taken 8 years. Cecile said some things take the time they take, and that was not a reproach, and they both knew it was not. They sat on the porch for 2 hours. Cecile brought tea and they drank it in the afternoon light, and Cecile talked about Priya in the way a mother talks about a person she has had years to grieve fully enough to also remember clearly, which is a specific and generous kind of talking, and Celine listened in the way she had learned to listen to patients, which was without the need to fix anything or provide anything except her attention. Cecile talked about the letters Priya had sent home during her service. She said Priya had written a letter after almost every significant training exercise, which was unusual for someone her age, and that the letters were detailed and precise, and sometimes funny, and always honest about what was difficult. She said Priya had written about Celine in 7 of those letters by name, which Cecile reported without drama, as a fact she thought Celine ought to have. She said that in each of those 7 letters Priya had mentioned one thing in some form, which was that she was learning from someone who believed the work was worth doing, regardless of whether anyone was watching it being done. Celine looked at the live oaks at the end of the front walk. She said she had not known Priya had written about her. Cecile said she knew that. She said she had kept the letters in a box, all of them, and that she had been thinking for 8 years about what to do with the ones that had Celine's name in them. She went inside and came back with an envelope. Not a box, an envelope which held 3 sheets of paper, which were photocopies of 3 of the letters. Chosen, Cecile said, because they were the ones that said the things she thought Celine ought to hear, and because the originals were staying in the box where they belonged. Celine took the envelope. She did not open it on the porch. She put it in the inside breast pocket of the coat she had left on the back of the porch chair, the coat that had been good once and was now simply warm, and which was carrying, by this point, more folded papers than it had been designed to hold. And she thanked Cecile, and meant it in the way she meant few things, which was without qualification, and without reservation, and with the full weight of what she was saying. They finished the tea. The afternoon moved around them the way afternoons do in the South in April, slowly and with warmth. And when Celine left, she took the long route back to the highway, through the streets of the town, and she drove with the window down and the air coming in the way it does in spring, with the particular and temporary quality of a thing that has been a long time coming, and that is, now that it is here, exactly what was promised. She did not reach for the disc at her wrist. She did not need to find it. She knew exactly where it was and what it said, and who had made it, and what they had meant by it, and the knowing was clean and without weight for the first time in 8 years, and the road ran out ahead of her in the spring light, and she followed it home.